Достаточно уникально, потому что это не просто лекция на языке, но лекция иностранного профессора Нормана Брауна, который прибыл к нам аж из Канады, из замечательного города Альберта, где он преподает. И преподает сейчас у нас на кафедре общей психологии, где он читает курс по вторникам исследований сексуальной изменений. Но это дополнительная информация, про что сегодняшняя лекция будет, я надеюсь, вы уже видели. Это лекция про влияние истории исторических событий на личность, на автобиографическую память, а затем, соответственно, на личность. Я не буду делать никаких долгих вступлений, но скажу одну важную вещь. Лекция будет идти примерно час-час 15, после чего мы оставим немного времени на 2-3 вопроса из зала. Все остальные вопросы, если захотите, вы сможете задать в кулуарах. И перед вами сейчас на столе лежат 2 бумажки. Надеюсь, перед каждым они лежат. Из них одна бумажка — это наша стандартная форма обратной связи. Мы просим ее заполнять, ни на чем не настаиваем, но если вы ее заполняете, вы делаете нам большую услугу, потому что мы стараемся совершенствоваться, как-то опираясь на эти формы. Вторая бумажка — это часть довольно большого исследования, которое Норман ведет в нескольких государствах, о которых мы в том числе и писали, и в котором он предлагает поучаствовать вам. Это в определенной мере уникальная возможность, потому что исследование международное, и мы вот здесь прям практически вот очень настоятельно просим заполнить этот бланк. Лучше не во время лекции, конечно, а после. Мы оставим немножко времени для этого, и, соответственно, если вы хотите, вы сможете даже немного задержаться, отдать это Норману. Это будет очень мило с вашей стороны. Заранее спасибо. И теперь я с удовольствием передаю под ваши аплодисменты, конечно, слово.
Sasha, that was so generous. Thank you so much. But I mean, thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak to a broad audience of people here in Moscow. It's very interesting and, I must say, a challenging task that I have before me. But thank you. I hope that you can understand what I'm going to say, in part because I don't speak your language and I'm not sure how well you understand English, and in part because people who speak English sometimes don't understand what I'm saying. So there'll be pictures. Okay, there'll be lots of pictures. I think before I begin, I just want to mention that Dr. Novikova and some of her students have handed out some questionnaires. It would be great if you filled them in, and it would be even better if you could return them to the people that were here, or just put them up here at the end of the talk, because those are actually data, and we'll be discussing topics related to that, and indeed the use of the scale very much like this. So this is a case in which my compensation for giving this talk are an N of 50, so it's pretty good. So how to begin? This is always a hard talk to begin, particularly when you don't get the buttons to work. Veronica said, never touch anything. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's think about what's going on today. Okay, this has been kind of an interesting period in your lives, maybe, but I mean, Ebola's out there. I don't know, I don't understand the media in Russia, but through the wonders of the internet, I can follow the news in North America. And people are freaking out. You know, the United States is going crazy, and Canada is close behind. This is the plague, right? People are very, very afraid. 4,000 people in West Africa have died. That's a large number, but it's a very small number. It's very isolated. But the point is that we're aware of this here. It's history. It's going on. We're aware of it. ISIS. 6 months ago, people thought ISIS was an Egyptian goddess, right? And now everybody knows that they behead journalists, and not because they're bad writers, but because they happen to come from North America or Britain. Really bad. I mean, and the videos, man, the snuff films are horrible, atrocious. And they're making progress, and the war in Iraq is starting to crank up again. The United States, even Canada, is getting dragged into it. Things are happening. And of course, the crisis in the Ukraine. So I think you people are aware of that. And I've watched a little bit of Russian TV, and although I can't understand it, I do understand that there are lots of guys in uniforms running around. Right, so I assume that this is a big deal. I know from both sides of the Atlantic that sanctions have been imposed on Russia, and as a consequence, you people are experiencing a fairly substantial increase in the cost of living. That, by the way, is going to be followed by inflation, and that, by the way, is going to be followed by dissatisfaction or something else. So you're living in history. I'm living in history. We all are, in a sense. But, let's roll back the clock a little bit and think about just a couple of years ago. Well, there was this coup in Egypt where they overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood president. The government was replaced by essentially a military dictator. This guy Snowden. Is he still in Russia? He's still. Is he in the audience? Would you raise your hand? I wanted his autograph. Anyways, that was big news a year ago, and now it's like, oh yeah, I kind of remember him. And then there was this kind of minor revolution in Mali, which kind of was beaten back by the French Foreign Legion. You might remember that, you might not. If you were living in Mali, you probably would. Yeah, but let's go back even further to the thing that's hidden under there. Okay, like 2008, right? It's like, wow, 6 years ago. The financial crisis, I don't know how strongly it hit you folks, but in North America it was a great big deal. I have a brother-in-law who's on Wall Street. He was freaking out. Obama was elected, President Obama in the United States of America. That was like a feel-good moment for just about everybody except the Republicans. And then Russia had a little war in Georgia. What did it last, 2 weeks? It didn't last very long, maybe a week, 10 days. Do you remember that? You can shake your hand. That's good, thank you. So, but you can get this sense that stuff is always happening, and it looms large now. That's why the font is so much bigger on the top of the screen than see, I tried to make it artistic. It just didn't work out. Next time I'll be more extreme, but it kind of rolls over us. History lives around us, important events are happening, but somehow, at least in North America, to your average citizen, it seems so far away. It's like watching something on TV. It's media, it's something that you kind of keep aware of, you might have opinions about. It might actually upset you a little bit. But not nearly as much as if, for example, you lost your laptop on the train. That would upset you, right? You go crazy. But, Ebola, I hope I don't get it, but it's out there. And for the most part it is, and yet somehow there's this notion that history, public events, play an important role in the way that people think about and understand the world. Now, a lot of this has been studied in an area that's called, at least in North America, the research area, which is kind of a hybrid. It's called the study of collective memory. And collective memory is the biased belief about the past. Okay, usually groups represent their past in particular ways, and groups in opposition usually present the past in opposing ways. But the idea is there's something about the past that gets captured, represented, and transmitted. For the most part, this research has been studied by people in the humanities, maybe some people in sociology, but typically what they study are artifacts. Books, magazines, movies, speeches, statues, holidays, kind of products of kind of the social collective. But that's a little frustrating to a psychologist because really, what we're interested in is not the junk out there. That's really just the stimuli in the environment. But what's going on in the head, right? I mean, you can be exposed to all of this stuff and ignore it completely, forget about it, not knowing why it's there or what it's supposed to mean. So studying memory in the world from a psychological perspective is kind of fundamentally unsatisfying. Now, another way to do it is to study memory in the head, okay, which is to understand what people know about the past and how they know what they know. And that's kind of the part of the research program that I'm involved in. And I should note that understanding this question is really important. I mean, it's not arbitrary, right? It's not just because I like to read the newspaper. It turns out that group identity is often based, at least in large part, on collective memory, on beliefs about historical events in the past, and that these beliefs about the past often come into conflict, right? So present events now, eventually, some of them might be transformed into aspects of group identity. So you can certainly imagine, for example, the crisis in the Ukraine is going to be carried forward. Maybe it will be forgotten in Russia, I don't know. I don't have the intuition about Russians, but you can be pretty sure that a lot of people in the Ukraine are going to be carrying a grudge for a long time to come. And if they carry it beyond one generation to another generation, or if it's politically expedient to turn this into a turning point in the history of a nation or a people, then this could go on for hundreds of years, right? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't have a crystal ball. But the point is, this is the type of group conflict which is going on now, which could be captured, represented, and transmitted into the future and precipitate further conflict in the future. So it's not an arbitrary or simple question. As it turns out, for a variety of reasons, I think mostly methodological, but also just sociological, there's been an incredible amount of work on memory in the world, right? There are whole humanities departments now which do this. There's been very, very little research concerning memory in the head. There's some work on what events are particularly famous in different countries by a guy named Howard Schuman at the University of Michigan. There's been a lot of work on flashbulb memories, that is, the accuracy of your memory for receiving news about an important event. But that's about it. That really pretty much exhausts everything that's been studied. And so, first of all, the field is wide open. And second of all, because the field is wide open, there are lots of questions to ask. And what I want to do today is ask, tell you about a project that I've conducted, which essentially asks the question, when is it that this stuff that's outside, this news, these public events, which we're aware of and might be interesting, cease to be the backdrop and become part of who we are, when they become incorporated into our identity and when they come to structure our autobiographical memories. So that's the question I'm asking. And what I'm going to do tonight is give you an overview of the project that I call the Living in History Project. I'm going to describe a general method which we've applied with the help of collaborators around the world in 14 countries, and to date it's produced 24 samples, at least these are the samples I'm directly involved in. We use an inductive method here. We try to find places where things might be interesting, and that method has led us to draw inductive conclusions, and there are 9 of them that I want to discuss tonight. And I'll discuss the conclusions and I'll elaborate a little bit on their implications. And then, if you guys are still with me, because it really is a talk in and of itself, one of the things that's come out of this project, in part because nobody's ever looked here before, is that it's imposed on me a new way of looking at autobiographical memory, or at least a new emphasis on the way of looking at autobiographical memory. And I've started to formalize the approach into a theory that I call transition theory. So if I have time, I would like to just give you a brief introduction to transition theory, and then we'll close it out. So the Living History Project. dramatic pause. Okay, the aim is to understand when and why historical events and autobiographical memory become entwined. So the basic idea here is what I want to do is understand generation zero. It's kind of like an analogy to ground zero, right? Like to understand when it is that history, public events, essentially affect people to such a degree that it becomes part of their lives. And this is really important in part because it affects the way these people understand the world. But it's also important because it grounds the knowledge that future generations will have about the past, right? And it seems like if there's a public event in which everybody knows about but nobody's part of, then the people who are reporting it, the people who are representing it, the people who have some reason to turn it into some symbolic structure are free to say what it is they want to say. But on the other hand, there are other types of events in which lots and lots of people are involved in, and when they're involved in those events, maybe what happens is the transmission of the knowledge of that event is grounded in the experience of real people. And I think that's probably an important thing to understand and an important distinction to make. So the beginning of this is really quite straightforward, right? It basically started with some observations. I study autobiographical memory, and I know the area pretty well. And one of the things I understood, and one of the things that's been well understood for decades, is that life-altering events, events that are called landmark events, spawn what's called lifetime periods. So for those of you that lived outside of Moscow and then you moved to Moscow to go to university, you think about things as, well, before I moved to Moscow in my college years, right? For those of you that have traveled and maybe spent a year or two abroad, you can think of, oh, the time when I was living in England, right? So the idea, or, you know, so the idea is that when people are experiencing these major changes in their lives, they know they're experiencing them, but one of the consequences is they spawn, they produce periods, lifetime periods. They're labeled and they have certain features that we'll talk about later. So this is autobiographical memory 101. Okay, everybody knows this, everybody believes this to be true. And then you simply add another observation, and in my case it's an armchair observation because it's never happened to me, but it seems that in principle public events can have life-altering effects. Right, so if you're living in eastern Ukraine now, when your town gets blown up, then you have to go somewhere else. You know, your life has been changed. So the idea is that given that life-altering events produce periods, given that public events can be life-altering, it follows that public events might spawn what I call HDAPs, okay? And HDAP is an acronym that stands for, you can see people don't like that. Nobody does. HDAP stands for Historically Defined Autobiographical Period. Okay, and I use this acronym, and there'll be one other acronym here, HDAP. But I use it because I get tired of saying Historically Defined Autobiographical Periods. It's a mouthful. Okay, so the empirical questions, right? That was just armchair psychology. So the empirical question is, do they exist? How should I know? Right, I'm just sitting in my armchair in Edmonton, Alberta. Nothing happens there. It snows. Oh, by the way, thanks for arranging the snow for my visit. Makes me feel at home. So do these HDAPs exist, right? Or are they just fictional creations of the fevered mind of a psychologist trapped in the tundra of Canada, right? I mean, is there a psychological reality behind this argument? And the second is, if they do exist, when do they exist, where do they exist, and why do they exist, right? So they're empirical questions, and then there's kind of the underlying theoretical question. And I hope to provide some answers to all of this. And in order to provide these answers, I came up with a fairly simple method. And again, the methodology is right off of the shelf from research and autobiographical memory. It involves, okay, so HDAPs, their origins. I've got one method which I've applied in 13 countries, and I have 12 samples and 9 claims. Okay, so okay, so the method, 2 phases. Phase 1, really simple. Anybody that's taken a course in autobiographical memory, anybody that's done research in autobiographical memory has used this method. It's called the Krolitz method, or the Galton's walk method, or the Q-word method. We just give people individual words. And these are neutral words and not intended to elicit emotions or to harken back to any particular historical period. Things like river, ball, bread, chair. They're nice words. Dog, not so nice, but so that's boring. Okay, so the task simply, here's a word, radio. Recall an autobiographical word that's specific and that's at least 1 year old, 1 week old, and write that event down on an index card, on a piece of paper. You get a separate piece of paper for each word, you write the event down. It's primitive, really. The second task is really not much more complicated. We simply shuffle these cards, we give them back to the subject one at a time, and we ask them to estimate which year the event took place. Okay? Just when did it happen? So you're all thinking about your radio memories now, and you're thinking, that would happen when I was in high school, blah, 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 and then you write down 2007. And there's only one slight difference. What we do is we collect verbal protocols. So what a verbal protocol is, I don't know if you people use this method, but instead of people just writing down what the answer to the question, we have them think out loud. So they tell us the thoughts that are running through their heads. It's not a free association. We don't care how they feel about their radio. We don't even care about how they feel about the radio event. What we care about is what people say in terms of what information they bring to bear on the event that had to do with the radio. Okay, so it's very task-directed. And here we use a tape recorder. I think we're now using digital audio recorders. We've really gotten sophisticated technologically. And that's it. You could do it yourself. You could go home and do this experiment. So what's the rationale? I mean, why on earth travel all over the world to collect these data? Well, the rationale is this. Basically, the word cue task, plus or minus a little bit of hand-waving, provides a representative sample of the contents of autobiographical memory. Okay, so it gives you a sense of what events specific events that people can remember, but more importantly, it also gives you a sense of when those events happen, so how events are distributed, memorable events are distributed across the life course. And the dating protocols, well, first of all, with the dating protocols, people typically reconstruct dates. So what that means is almost nobody has calendar dates in their head for more than a handful of events. Right, so if I wanted to recall a dog memory, and I remember, tripping over my dog when I was taking a run, because I really like my dog, I would have to think, well, geez, I remember we got the dog because it was a bride because I was going away. That was my second trip to Denmark, so that was in 2005, but the dog was old enough to run, so that would be a couple of years older, and so it was 2008, right? So it's called date reconstruction, and everybody does it, right? Nobody says, oh yeah, that was March 3rd, 2008. That information does not exist in our heads. So you can either guess and say, oh, that seems like a long time ago, or you go through this rather challenging but also extremely explicit cognitive process, and we take advantage of this fact in this study. Because what we found in the past, using a variety of converging methods, is that you can interrogate the contents of these protocols to find out information about what the structures of autobiographical memory are, what's connected to what the big important landmark memories are, and what the minor landmark memories are, and what events are connected up in what ways to these events. So it follows that if we're collecting data in some joint, some place where these historically defined autobiographical periods exist, where they're common among the people in a particular society, then what we should do is find that people often mention those events in their protocols, right? So for example, if we collected data in New York City and 9/11 caused a change, a real dramatic change in people's lives, as it's often asserted, then you might expect New Yorkers to say things like, wow, that happened before 9/11, that happened after 9/11, right? I mean, that's the type of thing you would expect. And if you got that over and over and over again, you would say, well, this would seem to be an important structural element in the way that people organize their lives. So if these HDAPs exist, they should be mentioned in protocols, and if so, this should yield what we call a living in history effect. Okay, and the living in history effect is basically just the frequent mention of these historically defined periods in dating protocols, right? Usually people talk about their own lives, but if you happen to be living in history, then you switch your frame of reference from a personal frame of reference to a public frame of reference. So here's our collection as it stands. As you can see, we've got a lot of data from the former Yugoslavia, data from the US, Canada, Israel, Denmark, Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Lebanon, the Netherlands, okay? And there are a variety of reasons why we collected these samples, but one of the things that's noteworthy about them is that some of the subjects who participated in these experiments were young people, usually college or slightly post-college. Some were middle-aged, and we have some people who are downright geriatric, right? So we've collected data from people across the lifespan and a wide variety of countries. And it was useful to do so because, as I say, I mean, the approach that we take is fundamentally an inductive one. Before I move on to our findings, which are represented as claims, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the data are. So remember, we're not interested in the events themselves, or actually I am, but that's another talk. What we're interested in is what people say in the protocols. So here's what we do is to keep it as simple as possible. First of all, we determine whether people have justified the protocol by saying something relevant about the date. And if they have, we simply try to pick out the type of information that they use. We're not trying to follow their logic or, the actual strategy. We're just looking for particular types of information. So one type of information is what we call personal generic. So here's an example. So the subject got the word box as a cue. You can think that's a pretty neutral cue. It doesn't get any more neutral than box. And here's the protocol. My siblings and I took the large box from our new washer and dryer and took turns tipping ourselves over inside. There it is. That's what autobiographical memory is. This example is a good example. It's a digression, but mostly what people have in their heads for specific memories aren't those really important events, but just things which are a little distinctive, might involve a little bit of emotion, but mostly just funny, interesting, different things that have happened. And if you use this task, you realize that. And here's the protocol. Okay, I don't honestly remember how old I was, right? So this person didn't actually have a calendar date associated with the event, but I do know it was in my old house, right? So probably there's some details about the memory, about the backyard that they're tipping the box over in or whatever. So now living in this old house becomes the period, right? It's a period which is defined by a location. That was in my old house, and I moved there when I was 4, right? So there's the temporal reference point, and then she goes on and on. But anyway, so the point is, this is typical, right? The individual has recalled a really mundane but distinctive event, and she has dated it with reference to a personal landmark. The next type are these HDAP references, and they involve references to political events or conflict. So here's an example, another example, pencil. Pencil is a cue word, and for those of you that have, it's usually hard to come up with pencil memories, but here's a nice memory, right? I was collecting fancy pencils, and I was surprised when my cousin sent me a nice one in a letter. Okay, so this is another kid memory. These are fairly young subjects. And you can see this isn't like a life-altering event. I mean, it reflects well on the cousin. I don't know if it reflects so well. Maybe all these people collect pencils, but it's normal to me. But you move from this kind of nice, kind of family-type oriented memory to something like, oh, that was 1993 or 1994 because it was during the war, and that's approximately how old I was. It wasn't 92. These data were collected in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and Sarajevo endured a 3-year siege starting at the kind of the middle of 1992. So that was during the war. It was the middle of the war, but I don't know if it was 93 or 94. Okay, so in contrast to the other one, the previous protocol where the subject was dating the event with reference to her own life, this subject was dating this personal event, and it was a very personal event, right, with reference to a horrible siege that he was living through. You see the contrast? Right, so this is what we're interested in, is where and when we get this situation where these personal events become dated with reference to these public periods. And then finally, there are the occasional references to popular culture, sports, or weather, things like spoon. I practice bending the spoon, and then we get this reference to the matrix, which is lost on me, but apparently some people understand it. So anyways, that's the method, right? So what we're really interested in is how people date the events, and then in part when they use these different sources of information. So the first claim is that people don't live in history. Okay, HDAPs, historically defined autobiographical periods, are the exception rather than the rule. And this LIH effect is rare. And so let me just show you what life looks like when you live in a boring place. So, I mean, these figures are good because you'll be seeing a lot of them, so I should walk you through it. So basically what we've got along the y-axis are the percentage of justified responses, right? So we take all of the responses that the subjects give us, we bin them by the year that the subjects say the event happened, so that's the estimated year of occurrence. And then you can see that we get kind of a recency effect, and we get a distribution. But these light gray bars represent those personal memories which are dated with reference to things like when I was living in the old house, when I was dating Susie, when I was living in Cleveland, right? The black bars represent references to public events of any sort. I think in this case that's a 9/11 reference, and that is a reference to Hong Kong returning to China. But the main point here, the inescapable point, is that regardless of whether you're in Edmonton, Alberta, or you're living in Aalborg, Denmark, which is at the tip of North Jutland, you're not living in history, right? Your life is the frame of reference that you use to understand your life is a frame of reference which is defined by personal landmarks and not public ones. And that's a good thing. That's the way life should be. So claim number 2, intense prolonged conflict produces H-stabs. The LIH effect is present in samples from war-torn regions. And the war-torn region that I focused on most intensively is a place called Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is part of the former Yugoslavia. And the city that I've collected all of my data in is Sarajevo, which is the capital. And Sarajevo endured a very bad war. So it's very brief. I'm not going to give a history lecture tonight, but you need to know a little bit of history about the Balkans. So there was once a country called Yugoslavia that emerged, I think, slightly before World War II, and then it disappeared again, and then it reappeared after World War II. And as the communist world was disintegrating, Yugoslavia was disintegrating into kind of ethnic enclaves. So at the outset, 1991, Croatia and Slovenia declared independence. Between 1991 and 1995, there was a civil war in Croatia against what was then known as the Rump Republic of Yugoslavia, and eventually became known as Serbia. In 1992, Bosnia-Herzegovina felt that they had to declare independence for a variety of reasons. There ensued a horrible civil war, which resulted in some 200,000 fatalities in a country of about 3 to 4 million people. Okay, so think about that. Right, I mean, it's a country that's a quarter of the size of Moscow. 200,000 people got killed in the course of 3 years. Okay, it was terrible. And during that war, my subjects were living in this city, Sarajevo, which was under siege. So basically, these were Bosniaks, Muslims, a variety of people, but basically non-nationalistic Serbs. And they were in the city, they were cut off from the outside world. The city is in a valley. So basically, the people were getting sniped at continuously, mortar shells were being thrown. Anyways, the point is that if you were living in Sarajevo, whatever you were doing before the siege, you weren't doing it after the siege started. Your life changed. It changed radically immediately. In 1999, there was an air war against Serbia, lasted 9 weeks, and resulted in 3,000 casualties. So it wasn't a small thing, but it was orders of magnitude less intense than what happened in Bosnia. So anyways, this is what the data looked like. Remember those data from Denmark and from Canada? Well, here what you've got are these thick black bars, right? These are references to the Civil War. So essentially what these subjects are saying is, well, I was kind of living my life over here, and now I'm kind of back to living my own life. But for this period here, virtually everything I thought about is understood in the context of the Civil War. So this is what I call the living history effect. And here what you can see is that overall, right, these people have gone on to live their whole lives, but 24% of their memories are dated with reference to the Civil War. So claim 3, HDAP references are temporally clustered. The LIH effect mirrors the duration and intensity of events that produce the HDAPs. So here, you can see that the worst years of the war fell between 93 and 95, and you can also see that most of the HDAP references fall within that range. Of course, it's also interesting that you get before the war and after the war responses. And what's also interesting is that the after the war responses stop. So it's not like people just alter their orientation towards the world and now always think about their lives with respect to public events. Instead, what happens is when those public events cease to define what's happening in their lives, they go back to this personal orientation. Major natural disasters spawn HDAPs. The LIH effect is present in samples from the affected regions. So here are data from a city called Izmit, Turkey. And Izmit experienced a devastating earthquake in 1999. And the interesting thing about this is that when you introduce earthquakes, natural disasters, you pop up a level, right? You can't say, well, this has to do with group conflict per se. It has to do with catastrophe per se. The catastrophe can be a catastrophe, a political, economic, military catastrophe imposed by your fellow man, or it can be imposed externally by the powers that be. Claim number 5, intense conflict creates HDAPs in people of all ages, although the effect is weaker for people who are children during conflict. So, here are 5 samples from Bosnia, and what you can see is that the subjects of these samples ranged in age from 8 to 54 on average. They all produce a substantial LIH effect. But the effect is mitigated slightly in kids, perhaps because they didn't know. There was no before, there was no change, because their lives were changing so rapidly anyways. But the main point here is that the LIH effect is age independent. And what that means is that, unlike some theories of autobiographical memory, people's lives are being organized and structured even long after they've gone through a period, a formative period, which often figures prominent in theories of autobiographical memory. Claim 6, HDAP formation is intensity graded. The LIH effect reflects local intensity of HDAPs, creating the HDAP creating historical events or natural disasters. So here, I just want to put up a comparison between Bosnia, where things were really bad, and the neighboring now nations of Serbia and Montenegro. So you do get some action, and particularly you get a little spike for the NATO bombing, but it's many times less pronounced than in Bosnia. Here's data that we collected in Beirut, Lebanon, and in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So Beirut was the center of a very long-lasting civil war. And the war began and was most intense in 1972. And then things calmed down a little bit. And then in 1982, the Israelis invaded Lebanon, and Beirut was bombed and under siege for quite a while. So you can see, like, the historical record and the autobiographical record mimic each other. What you can also see is that the LIH effect is quite a bit stronger in Beirut than it is in the Bekaa Valley, but that's because the civil war was much more intense in Beirut than it was in the Bekaa Valley. Okay, the LIH effect reflects the intensity of natural disasters as well. So here we've got Izmit, Turkey, and we've got a comparable sample from Ankara, Turkey, which is a city that's about 200 kilometers away. It's the capital of the country. And this is interesting, because what it says is it doesn't really matter how much you care about something, right? After the earthquake, Turkey was flooded with, the Turkish media was flooded with stories and appeals about the earthquake, and the Turkish people, I'm sure, responded very strongly in the wake of these appeals. But nonetheless, you get the effect in Izmit, and no matter how upset people were in Ankara, it didn't produce a change which was reflected in the way that they organized and represented their autobiographical memories. Claim number 8, terrorism does not create HDAPs. The LIH effect is absent regardless of whether the attacks were chronic or exceptional. So here are data that we collected in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's kind of an interesting place. When we collected this, they were still kind of in the wake of 2 rounds of kind of terrorist attacks associated with the Intifada. But there's nothing, almost nothing. This memory here is a memory of attending a pro-marijuana rally, which I guess is a form of political involvement, but it's not exactly what you would expect in a country which is built around kind of military engagement. So the point here is that although you get a giant effect in Lebanon, it's absolutely absent in Israel. So how about the 9/11 effect? So in North America, in the United States, 9/11 was a big, big, big deal. Kind of the cliche that came in its wake is everything is different, right? The world has changed. America is different. We're all different now. And so I wanted to see whether that was true, so I collected data in a couple of locations. One was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And as you can see, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was simply no LIH effect. 9/11 didn't register. Maybe they were playing Ohio State that weekend, I don't know, but it's just not there. And this is the 9/11 effect in New York City. You see it? It's very small. In fact, it doesn't exist, right? It's 1%, less than 1%. So in spite, so it's worth noting what's going on here, okay? So terrorism, in spite of its dramatic political impact, fails to produce HDAPs. So why is that? Well, in New York City, there was an undeniable emotional political impact, right? There's simply no question that this was a big deal and people were very upset and there are psychological consequences. But it had a very limited effect on a long-term way of life. If you were in the military, it did, but if you were an average citizen, basically you were expected to deal with tax cuts and go to the shopping mall. That's what the president wanted us to do. So, although people felt like there was a change, in a material sense, in a concrete sense, there was very little change in the United States over the following few years. Israel, I think the story is different. Basically, conflict in Israel is a constant, right? Israel is a martial society which is built around defending itself against external threats and internal threats. So security issues are a constant. It's part of a long-term way of life. So the fact that the intensity of the threat is increased or decreases over time is simply something that people adapt to fairly readily and go about their business afterwards. So it's integrated into the fabric of daily life in Israel. Once formed, HDAPs last a lifetime. So we've collected World War II generation data from Denmark, from the Netherlands, from non-combatants in Canada and the United States. Also, another lab has collected data in Germany, and they have data from people that were alive in Berlin during the war, and also Germans who were less, in a rural area of Germany that was much less affected by the war. So these are my data. And what you can see is pretty much everything that we saw beforehand, right? We've got a substantial LIH effect in the Netherlands, somewhat reduced in Denmark, and reduced further in the United States and Canada. And so you can see it's temporally graded. It is also intensity graded, right? Things are a lot worse in the Netherlands than they were in Western Canada, that's for sure. And the striking thing is it lasts a lifetime. These are people who are looking back over 60 years. They didn't have to talk about this. There was an awful lot of life that took place after the war, but it's still, particularly in the Netherlands, quite alive. And now if we look at the German data, again, I didn't collect these, but the effect is even more robust. You can see that in Berlin, 26% of the responses of the data estimates, 26% of the dated events were dated with reference to World War II. So that's pretty dramatic when you think about it, right? And this is literally, 2 generations later, and these people, they're just dredging up random events and dating them, are drawn back to the war 25% of the time. And again, it is, as we would expect, intensity graded. The war had less of an impact on northern Germany, and the effect is mitigated substantially. So the final claim. Political upheaval per se does not create H-stabs. The end of communism failed to produce robust LIH effects. Okay, so many of you, I think, are probably too young to really remember. Or you guys look very young. It was a big deal, I'm told. So here are the data. And some of this I've already shown you. So in Serbia and Montenegro, the effect is minimal. We collected some pilot data here a few years ago in Russia. 5% of the estimates were dated with reference to public events, and only half of those events were events associated with the breakup of the Soviet Union. More recently, we collected data here, 1%, Azerbaijan, 1%, Uzbekistan, 1%. East Germany, we would expect that there was a kind of dramatic change in the fabric of daily life. Still not a dramatic effect. Right, it's a pretty small number compared to, for example, the long-term impact of World War II in Germany. So what do you think? Let me leave this up here for a minute. I'll take a drink. When I put the 9/11 data up in New York, people start throwing things at me. Everybody wants to live in history. We also collected some additional data, which are data very much like the data that you collected. So we had our subjects fill out the transitional impact scale, but instead of asking them about the Crimea, we asked them about the collapse. So 12 questions, they assessed material change and psychological change associated with the event, and we had 3 samples, as I mentioned before, Russia, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan. And our subjects were all young adults when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, so it's not like they were kids, it's not like they didn't understand what was going on. Okay, so I'm just going to put this up, you don't have to write it all down. Oh, in fact, you saw all this, right? So this is the transitional impact scale. There are essentially 2 subscales. One of them is intended to gauge the degree to which a particular event impacted people's material circumstances, and the second scale is aimed at assessing the degree to which the target event affected their psychological states and beliefs. So, since you guys all did this, I'm going to tell you about it. So here are the data. And these data are in press, a paper that Professor Markova and I have recently published. So these are the data for material change. There's really no difference, right? There's a moderate impact, right? These people who, from the vantage point of 20 years, say, yeah, things changed, it's a little different. My life changed a little bit, but mostly what they're saying is, wasn't a big deal, right? It's kind of at the middle of the scale, maybe a little higher, which you would expect, but not real high. And there are no between country differences, right? So it's not like the Russians felt like there was more material change than the Uzbeks or the Azerbaijanis. The psychological change, though, is a little different. In fact, this is quite interesting. So, here we get large between country differences. And what you can see, in particular, is Russians. I mean, it's not like they're reluctant to use the middle of the scale, but they're just saying, no, I was a Russian before, I'm a Russian after, and that's it, you know. I mean, not like, that's what this is saying. Like, they're simply rejecting these things. It changed what you believed, it's changed what you think about the world, it changed your understanding, your sense of right and wrong. The Russians are saying, no impact. On the other hand, the Azerbaijanis are up at 4, right? So what they're saying is essentially, you know, although it didn't really change my material circumstances, I think of myself differently now. I think of the world differently now, right? Like my understanding of the world has been dramatically altered. So it's the same event in a sense, but and it's an event which had the same degree of material impact. But you can see that psychologically, the response and the reaction is very different across these 3 different cultures. So one of the things I take away from these data, just because this is the way I think about things, is you've got an interaction here, right? And you get no action for material change, and you're getting a really dramatic effect on the psychological change. So it seems to me that if there is an LIH effect, and the LIH effect is driven by psychological change, then you should have seen some differences between these 3 groups, and you did. And I'll return to this point. And what I suspect is that these types of responses are really important for predicting the LIH effect, but the threshold is probably about 4.5. So in other words, the entire world has to change quickly for everybody in order for people to live in history. I'm going to move on to that now. So when do people live in history? When do they refer to public events? Do they personal events? When do people form HDAPs? And the original formulation of my response to this question, again, this is something which is an inductive type of understanding which emerges from both the presence of these HDAPs in some populations, like in Bosnia, and the absence of HDAPs in other populations, for example, in Azerbaijan. And what it suggests is that this effect occurs, people live in history, only when public events change the fabric of daily life for a population for an extended period of time. Right, so otherwise you live in your own life, things go up, they go down, you deal with some variability, because things are always changing to some extent. But this effect occurs only when whatever you do most of the time, you can't do anymore. Your life has changed. So what do I mean by the fabric of daily life? What I mean by the fabric of daily life in a very broad sense is things like where you live, what you do for a living, who your friends are, the people you know and see on a regular basis, the places you hang out, what you eat, what you drink, what you consume, and what you do with your time, right? So the material, the stuff you can see in the world, that's the fabric of the daily life. Okay, so an example of a change in the fabric of daily life is a more mundane one, is we can move from war and disaster now and say, well, this is kind of like a general thing. This happens to everybody. People go through changes. They have transitions. And a good example would be something like moving, changing a residence, a typical personal transition. Your material circumstances change. You're living in a different place. You know different people. You see different people. But everything changes. There's some continuity. Yourself kind of goes with you. Sometimes your spouse goes with you. Often your occupation, interests. So these internal things are transportable, but there are a lot of things which aren't. So the question, kind of the early question that I asked are, these dating protocols sensitive to these fabric of daily life changes, right? Is there any evidence in any of these samples that might speak to that? And as it turns out, we were lucky because the data that we collected from people from the Netherlands were actually Dutch immigrants. And all of these immigrants moved to Canada in the late 40s and early 50s. So now we can look at these people and say, well, we've already seen what they have to say about World War II, but let's see where and when they talk about before I moved to Canada or after I moved to Canada. Right, so that's a life transition. So now we're going from a public event to a personal event. So there's a replication of the data. And the green bars here represent references to immigration. So you can see it's pretty much the same pattern. It's localized during this period when people were moving. And it seems like immigration is actually a pretty important transition. It seems to spawn a lot of events. But the main point that I want to make here is that now we've got two types of transitions, right? So we've got World War II, and this Dutch samples on HDAPs and references to World War II. And then we have immigration producing identifiable PDAPs, right? Personally defined autobiographical periods. So what this tells me is that when people break their lives up into periods, what's causing that are transitions, changes. That's how life is structured, by change. And the LIH effect says, well, you know, occasionally some unfortunate people live in history and change is imposed on them externally, but it can be extreme and can utterly define their lives for some period of time. But you can also have personal transitions, and immigration is a perfect example of one, where these people, of their own choice, got on a boat and moved from the Netherlands to Western Canada. All right, so two big changes, one imposed externally and one motivated by personal concerns and interests. So I would argue that what these data allow me to say is that the LIH effect, where it shows up, where it doesn't show up, provides evidence to the existence of these historically defined autobiographical periods, and that publicly defined autobiographical periods that form when public events radically alter the poorer population for an extended period of time. So that's the end of talk one. Are we done? I mean, I can go on.
try to remind them. I just wondered about the definition of the radically changing the fabric of daily life. The reason why I'm asking is because I personally fall into the category of people between 20 and 30s who need to break up with solitude. And probably I wouldn't define myself, or I wouldn't define my life by that event. I wouldn't categorize it, I wouldn't put it together. This period as a life-changing event for myself. Although it was in a way that it gave me the opportunities that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise if that change happened. And I was wondering if that fabric of life, changing daily life, has a negative effect on the population as opposed to a positive effect. For instance, if you question people who were, let's say, between the 40s and 50s, living at the time of the Soviet Union, they would experience their life as very, very negative at the time because their careers fell apart, their livelihoods disappeared, their savings in their bank accounts disappeared, etc., etc. So a lot of people in the kind of all elder generation would have probably said that their lives changed for the worse. Because for my generation, our lives changed for the better. And that's the reason why I would not define this as a life changing fabric of daily life changing plan for me. I think maybe it's not clear.
Yeah, I'm going to push my push button. Yeah, there's a lot there. It's a funny thing about opportunity. I think it seems that opportunity is out there. It's not part of the fabric of daily life. It is kind of something that society at some abstract level offers or fails to offer individuals. And so, in a sense, you know, it does, like, the part of the talk that I didn't give, I talk about transitions, and what I really think about transitions is that what a transition is based on what I call event components, right? These elements that you deal with over and over and over again on a daily basis. And what a transition is kind of the coordinated deletion or introduction of elements that we've become very familiar with. So I think it's very material, very, you might say, embodied. And when the structure, the physical structure of the world changes, that's what drives the change in memory, the organization of memory. Memories are built up by kind of essentially interassociations between these event components. So opportunity is a weird thing, like the economy is a weird thing too, right? I mean, like these are things which are out there and they affect what you can do and what you can't do in an abstract way. But I think people only have memories of things that they do, right? The changes that they do experience. As for the valence of the change, some people, I mean, it's really easy to make everybody's life terrible. You just turn off the water and the electricity, and within 3 days, people are desperate, right? So it's really easy to do that. It's really hard to make everybody happy. I've tried. I have kids. It's impossible. Can't do it. So that's one thing. I don't think positive change works at a societal level. And we have data from Berlin, from East Berlin, where I think most people would argue that it was a positive change, although most changes involve uncertainty and anxiety, and there are winners and losers. So it's not a... So given that I've seen no evidence whatsoever that psychological change per se is driving the effect, and given that it's hard to see it in positive circumstances are hard to see it, I'm just kind of left with this feeling that it's really a memory phenomenon, like it's a basic memory phenomenon, having to do with the stimuli that we're exposed to or not exposed to, like quite literally what we see and what we do. And these higher level kind of abstractions which play a role in defining who we are and how we live our lives are a little more abstract, because obviously if your goals change, then you're doing something different, right? But that's a material change that you pick up, right? So, I mean, it's not like they're completely unrelated, but if you didn't have a positive experience, the consequence of the collapse, and those opportunities didn't present themselves, you'd still live a life in which there would be constancy and change, and the periods of change, I think, would still structure you in